Hello, in this video, I want to get into the final four or the last couple of videos that I'll be doing in terms of talking about Black Marxism and the way that it pertains to the way that it relates to the specific upcoming water resolution. This first set of videos is going to particularly be about Black Marxism as an affirmative strategy and what I think about Black Marxism on the AF. I'll be kind of talking about what I think are just some kind of the strengths and weaknesses and like best forms of what I think this argument can do and some of the critiques that it can make and like its own perspective on the water resolution as a whole. And I think that in order for you to kind of understand some of the background for this video, it's definitely something that's discussed really intricately in the intro to Black Marxism and Water video that I did a while back in order to start this series off. And so I would definitely say starting in that video to get a background on a lot of the base ideas I'm thinking about just about the interaction between Black Marxism and the water resolution and some of the strengths of it on the affirmative can definitely be seen there, but this video will definitely be a little bit more detailed in terms of going into what I think are some of the ways that you can use it against specific types of arguments and the way that I think you'll be framing it against like various types of other arguments that we'll speak about in other videos. In this particular video, I want to start by talking about what I think are just some of the general strengths and weaknesses of it, and what I think are just like some of the places that you should be doing in order to really form a strong affirmative argument when thinking about Black Marxism. The first place that I think you really need to start is really thinking about what is the relationship that like racial capitalism has to the water resolution as a whole. I think that I always try to like consider these things starting at maybe like a local government level, community level, and then thinking about how they raise to the question of just like national histories and like more understood like cultural memories and sped outside of that. I think as like being someone that's like been well read on cases of things like the like water quality in places like Flint, Baltimore, and other urban cities that have like basically kind of like been subject to various types of like environmental harm. I think that is really important to kind of like start there and thinking about the particular types of ways in which like those types of governments invest in terms of in forms of local dispossession, because I think it frames and explains a lot of the kind of like central needs that like state and local and federal budgets face in terms of the decisions they have to make that basically make possible like racial dispossession in a bunch of ways. And I think that working from that point, you can really trace back a history of how just as water as a concept and as a resource has been part of like a source of control that has been used as like a particular type of racializing tool in the context of black folk, indigenous folk, etc., and has also been used as a like spatializing force in these contexts in order to produce a kind of like relationship that poses water as something that can be guaranteed as a right and something that also can kind of be like and guaranteed and removed in its relationship to like privatization, both of which I think are major sources that you can really problematize when you're talking about Black Marxism on the water resolution. I think the idea of a water rights framework or a protection framework based in human rights or based in the ability of like the public to like assess and make the government accountable is a failure in the context of Black Marxism, because I think a lot of the arguments that can be made from the context of like those that take from Mao and anarchists, etc., the idea that a human rights framework that is one that is deeply interested in history of how the U.S. is able to impose its own cultural and political models into like countries broadly, but also the way in which like human rights as an idea is something that is tied to the ability to be like a law-abiding citizen, a set of rights that can be stripped away when like faced with prison, etc. All are concepts that I think that racial capitalism have a really strong history of being able to grapple with. And I think even the idea that there is kind of like an equal holder investment into the public that doesn't assume that the public is kind of like managed by various forces of privatization is something that I think racial capitalism definitely debunks and allows you to come with a really strong core of central criticisms for what the resolution could look like, while also allowing you to really situate a lot of like things to set up why there's an urgency to the particular type of like material strategy I think can be offered in the face of like these types of barriers that are kind of being imposed as the frameworks that are currently available under the resolutional writing. I think when I'm thinking about some of the weaknesses or something to look out for when trying to develop this type of affirmative is how do you develop a methodology that doesn't defend so much that you're kind of like constantly debating indicts to various movements that you're not really like well versed in, or that you're kind of spread too thin in terms of having to really defend against all these different possible like counter plans and different types of strategies. But how do you still make a strategy that is able to kind of scale up and resolve a lot of the central tensions that are being made about like why the state and the particular framing of the resolution is parasitic to like what Black Marxism would look like at like a real attempt to like uproot the kind of like various types of investments into like neoliberalism that like the topic is kind of like bound by. I think that when you're trying trying to frame what these types of responses look like, I think there are various types of responses that you could take from historically in terms of just like identifying and saying that the resurrection or the particular like nationalization or usage of, like, for instance, black socialism widely can definitely be cited as various types of examples are available historically. I think that it could also be just really interesting for you to kind of move away, like I've said in other videos, from the idea of having to identify the method that you choose with like particular types of like parties or titles or names that are identified to specific organizations, and thinking about what types of tactical frames can you take up in order to be able to think about different types of tools, ideas, and tactics that you can use in order to like make these types of revolutionary actions possible, instead of like holding yourself to define these like really broad-based organizations that I think will be really hard to keep up with as like things change, and just like outside of the organizing form there are kind of like all these other interactions at play that I think it make it harder to like read these affirmations as a whole. And so I think moving down that type of like narrowing down of what you want the tactics can definitely help in terms of like patching up some of what I think could be like some of the weaknesses of this argument. I think that when you're talking about how you kind of then want to deal with it at once you've kind of like dealt with these questions, I think a lot of the arguments that you really want to do on cases like explanation of this methodology in the way that I've been explaining before, and then pushing a lot of the question of like how the winning of your explanation of your methodology means that there is a lot more weight to the claims that are being made about the weight and the kind of like crisis or the urgency that capitalism is kind of imposing and weighing on like the consequences of the debate. Thus it kind of means that all of the examples and like the inability of the other team in the negative to really grapple with the specific case debate that handles your examples means that you're able to really impose kind of like impact comparison to contextualize other types of offense throughout the debate, which allows you to make a lot of strategic cross applications that I think are just like generally helpful as like kind of the backbone for how this affirmative responds to like a various amount of arguments. I think then when you go on to like the framework and T portion of the debate, it can be really helpful in order for you to think about the way in which your interpretation can be guided by the way in which you're framing how debate is contextualized by the crisis of capitalism. I think things like Zoom and online debate definitely pose particular ways of talking about how capitalism and privatization touch debate in really ways that are like particularly interesting in the way that they change like the questions of accessibility, budgetary concerns, etc., that really make like debate as like an institution like basically still viable. And I think that there are a lot of arguments to be made about like how that codes what types of responses and ways we think about like the resolution when we're kind of confined within that institution. And then I think using that to like make interpretations about why the kind of available mechanisms that are described or allowed under the resolution doesn't allow a conversation that can really impose a particular like a socialist or black Marxist critique of what the water protections currently look like by the U.S. and the imposition or the refusal of that is kind of what legitimates and makes possible the continuation of various environmental crises, because it allows us to constantly deny the like imposition and like the importance of such a presence as like structurally guiding how we have such conversations, which I think can definitely be something that you cite in terms of talking about like how various types of affirmatives on this resolution will definitely be bringing up conversations of neoliberalism, privatization, and racism in the context of water protections. But I think it's important to win that those types of conversations cannot subsume the affirmative in terms of topical versions of the app, because of the way in which you're problematizing the very frame in which they're using in order to think through the question of racial dispossession and racial relationship to capitalism, thus making it kind of like impossible to really have a revolutionary type of tactic under the form that the resolution is kind of making possible. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll keep tuning in for more in order to get more of my thoughts about Black Marxism on the app, and then maybe some of my thoughts about how to answer this particular type of argument, because I enjoy doing these type of videos. Thanks.